Hi, I'm Petru Popescu and welcome to my course on Spring Boot. You can't talk about Spring without talking about beans. Bean, a bean is an integrated part of Spring and what makes it very powerful. Maybe you don't know what a bean is, so let me try to explain. A bean is just a normal class, but for which the Spring container controls the life cycle of instances of that class. This means that Spring determines when a new instance is created and when that instance gets destroyed. Normally, when you create a new instance of an object, you call the new constructor. However, Spring makes this a lot easier by allowing you to use objects without implicitly calling the constructor. This means that Spring and the Spring container controls when an object is created and when it's destroyed. Obviously, this is done with input from the developer because the developer knows exactly what the life cycle of an object should be. So that is why Spring offers a few different kinds of scopes for their beans. The default scope is singleton. For singleton beans, there is only one instance created for the entire Spring container, and this is the default behavior. This means that all requests go to the same bean. Even controllers are beans. There is a prototype scope, and this scope is when a bean is defined with this scope, it means that a new instance is created every time a bean is requested. It's the same as calling new every time you want an object. There is the request scope, and this means that there is a new instance created for each HTTP request. However, if multiple objects are required in the same request, you will always get the same instance back. Similarly, there is the session scope, where a new instance is created for each HTTP session. This means that requests from the same user will always use the same bean. And there is also application scope, which is similar to the singleton one, except now that a single instance is created across multiple servlet-based applications inside the same servlet context. There is also another one, a sixth one, which is WebSocket scope. And this only refers to beans that are used in WebSocket connections. The last four ones, so request, session, application, and WebSocket, are only for WebAware applications. So, how do you define a bean? Well, normally you create an object using new and calling the constructor. Similarly, you do this as well. However, you have an app configuration, and here you have a method annotated with @bean, and here you specify what object to be returned. So every time you request a random service, this method will be called and it will create a bean if it needs to. Depending on the scope, it can be created only once or multiple times. So I have here a get method on our test.html. I annotated it with @rest controller and it will return a random integer. If we go to our browser and if we go to test.html, we have to start our application first, sorry. And now we see that we are getting a random integer every time we refresh the page. As you can see, we never explicitly called new, but using the auto-wired annotation, we indicate to Spring, okay, we want a bean of this service, and Spring will determine how to create it using our annotation from this method. Things can get a bit more complicated, and the beans offer a lot of power to the developer. For example, let's assume that we have a random character service, which returns a random character from the list of characters that we have here. And in our getRandom method, we want to be able to return either uppercase characters or lowercase characters only, depending on how the bean is created. For this, we need to have in the constructor an option if we want to return uppercase or lowercase characters. This means that we need to actually have two beans, one that will return uppercase and one that will return lowercase. However, the implementation is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. Again, this is just an example for simplicity. Under normal circumstances and in complex applications, the business logic may be quite different. Anyway, we go in our configuration, and here I defined two beans, one that for random char service with uppercase, and one for random char service with lowercase. And now, because we have two beans that are from the exact same service, we need to give them names. And this is done using the qualifier. So we have one qualifier uppercase and one qualifier lower. And now I also created a char test controller where I will return a random character, one lowercase for char.lowercase, and one uppercase for char.uppercase. And each method from the controller will call the service depending on if we have uppercase or lowercase. And for this, I again created two instances, annotated them with auto-wired, and using again the add qualifier, I tell Spring which which instance to be injected. AutoWire will inject the appropriate service based on the qualifier name. As you can see, for the lower char service, I didn't specify any qualifier, and this is because I annotated this one with primary. This means that if I don't specify when injecting the bin, if I don't specify the name, it will inject the primary one. Now, if we go back to our controller, to our browser, and we go to char and we have /lower, we see that we generate a random character in lowercase. And if we go to upper, now we generate a character which is in uppercase. Beans are actually much more powerful than this. In most cases, we won't have one service that does something different depending on one parameter in the constructor. What we will have is multiple services that implement the exact same interface, and depending on the scenario, we want to call one service or another. For example, let's assume that we have a rounding service interface, which will round a double to 2, 3, 4, or how many decimal places we want. And we have two implementations. We have one service that implements rounding service, which rounds up to 2 decimal places. And we have another service that rounds to 3 decimal places. This time, we'll create the bins a little bit different. because Spring offers a lot of shortcuts that facilitate development and make things a lot easier for the developer. Instead of having an app configuration where we create a bean using the add bean annotation and a method, we can make it very simple. Because as you can see here, we just call the constructor, nothing special. So Spring offers a shortcut. It has an add service annotation that is the exact same thing as having a method with add bean that calls the constructor. There is also add component, which is the exact same thing. So add service, there is also add component, and also add repository. Add component is a generic component. Add service is a specialized component that is a service and does business logic. From a Spring's perspective, there is absolutely no difference. This is only to make the code a lot more easier to read and understand. And add repository is for services that communicate directly to the database. For example, data access object. The repositories can also have the JPA injected. So let's call using add service. And again, because we have two instances, one that rounds to 2 decimal places and one that rounds to 3 decimal places, we will be using a qualifier by providing it as a parameter to the annotation. And now we have a rounding controller where again I injected using autowired the rounding service with 2 decimal places and rounding service with 3 decimal places. And again, two methods that both round a value. For simplicity, I made it so that they round the same value so you can see exactly what is happening. And one rounds it to 2 decimal places, one to 3. And now if we go to our browser and refresh the page, we'll see that round that 2 rounds it to 2 decimal places, and around that 3 rounds it to 3 decimal places. Spring does make things even easier than this. If all that we are injecting are simple beans, we don't even need autowire. We can just remove this, make it this a final, and either create a controller manually or using lombok required arc constructor. Spring will know that this is a bean and it will automatically inject it. Let's refresh our application. As you can see, compilation was successful, even though we didn't specify what object to be created here. And now if we go to test.html, you'll see that everything works just like before. I hope everything was properly understood. Beans are an essential part of working with Spring and Spring Boot. It is important to know their life cycle and what is the proper way to use a bean, and most importantly, to know how to select the right scope for each type of bean. In most cases, you will use the singleton, which is the default one, and you won't need to think about anything else. That's it for this lesson, and I hope I'll see you again in the next one. Bye.